That done, let me introduce John Gans. John, thank you so much for being here tonight. John is Director of Research and Communications at the Perry World House at the University of Pennsylvania, doing some teaching there too. He left the Obama administration. His last job there was chief speechwriter for Ash Carter when he was Defense Secretary. Also some other speech writing work, I believe, Treasury. For Jack Lew, yeah? Oh no, was that the White House? Oh, okay, sorry. So when Jack Lew was at the White House. So he's done a lot of different things, mostly on the security side. And I did want to say he wrote this fabulous book, which I read and really enjoyed, called White House Warriors. So that's going to be kind of a little bit of the foundation of our conversation tonight. All right, so what we'll do, I've got some questions for John. He and I kind of talked a little bit. So we're going to do some questions up front. He and I will have a conversation about some stuff. And then we'll open it up, probably 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Some people submitted some things, so I might start with those, but we'll use the chat for questions that might be coming up during our conversation. All right, so let's start, John, maybe with kind of use the book as maybe a starting point. And I definitely promise John has lots of, I think, interesting observations on the current situation at the Defense Department, the NSC, and the transition and everything else. We will definitely get to that. But let's just use the book as a starting point and kind of get a little bit of context going. So we'll start with a really basic question. I assume a lot of people know this, but John did write a whole book about it. What is the National Security Council? And what can you say to people who think, who are these people? Like, who are they? What do they do all day? Are they making us safer? Just kind of give us a laydown of what this thing is, like, right? Just what does it do? What's its role? Oh, mute. I have to unmute you, or you. There you go.
We're all good at enough of this Zoom stuff that we can unmute ourselves. Thanks, Roz. Thanks for having me, and to the World Affairs Council of New Jersey. It's great to be here. I'm a Jersey boy, so I grew up at the shore down in Brigantine, and my wife and I moved here after the Obama administration ended and live in Haddonfield, south for some of you, and it's great to be home in New Jersey, and it's been a place that I think has handled this current security crisis relatively well, and so it's good to be with you. So thank you for having me. It's a great question, and I feel as though somebody who has spent the past year talking about the National Security Council in events like these and with the media, is that the National Security Council is relatively misunderstood, if it's understood at all. The National Security Council, of course, sort of tends to provoke images of presidents sitting in the cabinet room or the situation room with the biggest names in national security. Your vice president, your secretary of defense, your secretary of state, your chairman of the Joint Chiefs, things along those lines. That's the image that people think of, and that is when the National Security Council tends to make news. It is, the president, a crisis in wherever it is, Iraq, Vietnam, in Berlin during the Cold War, in Lebanon during the civil war there, in Afghanistan, there's a crisis. The president's convening the National Security Council to sort of discuss it. That's the news event. That's what we all tend to think. But the story of the National Security Council and its power is actually far from that room. And it typically speaking, the part of the National Security Council that matters doesn't even go to most of those meetings, right? The National Security Council was created in 1947 to get those big names and those big positions in one room, right? After World War II, which Franklin Roosevelt mostly ran single-handedly with a few aides out of the White House, out of the Oval Office, most of government was intent on prying some of that power away from the president. Part of that was just, frustration with being left out of the loop by Roosevelt, who liked to keep people out of the loop. That was his style. Part of that was fear. They were scared of fighting a massive two-front war against real serious enemies and adversaries, and they were doing it really when it was being run by a frail, infirm person, in a wheelchair in the White House, largely alone, and it scared them. And then the third part is when he died, there was a huge vacuum of knowledge and understanding and real awareness. The most impactful, most sort of easy way to describe that is Harry Truman, who was the vice president, didn't know about the Manhattan Project, didn't know about the nuclear weapon development program when he became president. And so there was even though the war was won, there was a genuine belief that we needed to do better if there was ever another war. And so there was a determined effort, led in part by Truman himself, to reform how government worked. And this was one of the biggest laws and most impactful laws that we've ever had, which was the National Security Act of 1947, which created the Defense Department, the Air Force, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, and the National Security Council. And what the National Security Council was just that. Everybody had to come into a room and get on the same page. And that was the intent of Congress. They just said, get everybody together. And what happened was in that massive law, there was one line which referred to a staff. A staff will be created to sort of basically serve a secretarial function to the National Security Council. Their job was to get everybody in the room on time, give them an agenda to talk about, and keep the minutes, and then share the minutes. That was the job. And from that one line of law, from a small staff at the beginning, it had about 12 people, has risen to be the most powerful actor and institution in national security councils in Washington, in national security parts of government. It's somewhere, depending on how you count, between 200 and 400 people on the National Security Council staff, and they serve at the pleasure of the president, and they help the president and helped presidents make decisions in war and peace. They've helped presidents they've shaped the wars in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Lebanon, the Cold War, Bosnia, Iraq again, Afghanistan, and more. Right? They shaped every part of our foreign policy. Over that 70 years, they've taken a lot of power from the State Department, but they've also taken a lot of power from the Defense Department, and they have concentrated a great deal of power in the White House. Now, that is the story that's pretty easy to tell, but that story gets complicated in the Trump administration, in which Donald Trump has, since even before he took office, really fought with government and with parts of government, and sought to sort of make enemies of the public servants that he calls the deep state. Some of them were on the National Security Council. And though he inherited probably the most powerful National Security Council in history, the one that worked for Barack Obama, he has cut it in by more than a third. He's pushed people out. He's ignored their advice and really damaged the institution. And so what you have is one of the reasons we are where we are. We have sort of experienced this horrible national security crisis, which is COVID, which is the biggest national security crisis of the National Security Council era. The staff has really been out of the loop and out of power. And so although I have my complaints and have criticized the staff in history in my time, they were not able to do their job on this particular crisis. And, we're all living with consequences. We're all sitting here on Zoom, we're all working on Zoom, right? And the reason is that national security policymaking in Washington has been broken. So it is a fascinating story. It's a story that that most people don't know. But the National Security Council, even a weak one, shapes the world we live in as we sit here on Zoom right now. And they will continue to shape the world we live in a Biden administration. And so it's an important story to know. It's a story most people don't know. And it was a really fun one for me to work on. It was a labor. Some days it was love, some days it wasn't. But it was a lot of fun. And, I have great stories from researching it, great stories. I interviewed, I think, 12 or 13 national security advisors, and got yelled at by Colin Powell, got sort of had a blast interviewing Dick Cheney. I did presidential archival research. I think I looked at about 10,000 original documents to write the book. And I exposed history that most people don't know. So it's a fun book, and the NSC is an important institution, and it's the one to watch in the weeks ahead as the Biden administration ramps up.
Okay, so we're going to get to that, I promise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think we're definitely going to land there because that would be fun to talk about. Let's talk a little bit more. So you talked a little bit about the staff. Maybe your book has tons of stories about staff members. You like choose. I'm thinking of Megan O'Sullivan, Doug Lute. These kind of use them maybe to tell the story a little bit of these episodes that they're very central to. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about who's actually on there. Who are these 400 people or 200 people? Because I know when I worked in intelligence, right, there's levels and levels of meetings and levels of staff. Very complex organization. For most people, maybe people think they all fit in the West Wing, but they would never fit on the West Wing. So they're spread over buildings and all kinds of stuff. So maybe you could talk a little bit about where they're coming from and how they have this role. Like, what is it that they, these ones that are very successful, like a Megan O'Sullivan or Doug, and I say successful in the sense they have influence. What is it that they're doing all day?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's a question that is the one that I get the most, because the National Security Council staff actually sits in the old executive office building, which is now the executive office building, which most people who I always ask this in person, and I assume some of you have been to Washington, but it is the big sort of Beaux Arts building that sits right next to the White House. And it used to be the State, War, and Navy Department building. And the State, War, and Navy Departments are, of course, the State Department, and the other two became the Defense Department, and they moved out right before World War II or right after. Remember, the Pentagon was built during World War II, which is one of my favorite stories from giving tours of the Pentagon, is that while we were fighting this giant war, we also built the biggest office building in the world at the time, and still a pretty big one today. And so the NSC staff sits there. They are generally they've gotten younger. The average age has decreased to low 30s, but they are, because the job has gotten far more demanding as telecommunications has kind of kept everybody going. But they are generally made up of two kinds of people. The first are what are called political appointees. So those are people the president appoints and his party appoint. That's people like the National Security Advisor, right, who most people come to know. It's been harder to keep up in the Trump administration because there's been so many of them. But that's a sort of household name, right? That came out of the staff, and that leads the staff, that job. Then there are, deputy national security advisors and a few others who are political appointees. They're typically the people who come in with the president. They're a speechwriter on national security matters, maybe his closest advisors or two, right? And they're there to kind of shape the institution in his or someday her image, right? So there's about 20 or 30 out of the 300 on the staff. The other pieces are what's called policy staffers, right? They work on geographic issues like Iraq or China, and some work on functional issues, right? Like counterterrorism, international organizations, human rights, and now pandemic and global health. And they tend to come they're lent to the White House from the agencies. So if you're a diplomat in the Foreign Service, you might go do a 2-year tour on the NSC, or you're an intelligence officer, you might go do a couple of years, or you're a military officer, you might do a couple of years. And so they rotate in for 2-year terms. And the reason for that is Congress never wanted to give a big budget to the White House for a National Security Council, in part because they never envisioned one in the law, right? The law was basically didn't have a limit on the size, but said, hey, we're going to you can have a hand, you'll have some staffers. And so there was a big fight, right when when it was first created, and Harry Truman's first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, went to the White House and said, hey, listen, I got this giant Pentagon over here. Why don't you have your National Security Council staff sit over here with me? I've got all the office space in the world. You don't need to give up any of your precious space. And the president's chief of staff said, you know what? We got it. They can sit with us. We'll make room for them. And that was the sort of first battle over the NSC, which was, are they going to be the president's people, or are they going to serve at the pleasure of the council? And they became the president's people. And so even though people come from the Navy, the Air Force, the Foreign Service, and come from other bureaucratic entities, they become the president's people and they serve at the pleasure of the president. And so this has become occasionally confrontational because sometimes they give advice to the president that countermeans their own services, right? So the perfect example of that is Doug Lute, who you mentioned, who became Ambassador Lute, but was a 3-star general, a brigadier general in the Army, who went to the NSC in 2000, and I'm not going to date it, 2007, right? May, June of 2007, when he was a 3-star Army officer, was considered one of the bright lights of the Army, and went to the NSC to serve as George W. Bush's war czar. Now, some of you might remember this time, but there was a little concern over the war in Iraq because it was going badly for a few years. And then there was George W. Bush decided on the advice of another NSC staffer, Megan O'Sullivan, who was a political appointee, but she was in there and she was a think tank person who went into the State Department and the White House. But the president, George W. Bush, decided to surge troops in Iraq and was basically told, you can do it, but you need somebody to help manage the war. Like if you're going to sort of overrule your chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and your commanders on the ground, you need somebody to help you manage this. You need to find what they called a war czar. And so he looked around for a bunch of retired generals to do it, but nobody would do it because nobody thought that it was a good idea, or nobody wanted the job because it was too demanding. And it finally turned to the Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates at the time, to order Doug Lute to do it. They basically sent him over on orders and he became the war czar. And he went over there and was basically the point person on the war. He met with President Bush every morning, told him what was going on overnight, carried out his orders. He was the person that, everybody on the ground, General Petraeus and others would call and say, hey, I can't get this money for something. I can't get this equipment. And Doug Lute would get it. He'd call over the Pentagon and get it. And he served as a point person. And on calls like this, because there's video teleconference call and on telephone calls, he was the point person. And it got to the point where he was so good that he was kind of indispensable to the war effort. And when George W. Bush left, President Barack Obama said, we want to keep you on. And they kept him on. And he continued to sort of fight for what the war fighters needed in the field and what the president wanted. And by the first year of the Obama's turn, people had started in the Army and in the Pentagon had started getting frustrated with Doug Lute because he was listening to Barack Obama. And they said, basically, your career is going to be in danger if you don't start listening to us and tell us and do what we want to do on what became the Afghanistan surge. And Doug Lute said, I serve at the pleasure of the president. He wore a business suit every day, even though he was a 3-star general, even though people sometimes called him General Lute. And he said, I serve at the pleasure of the president. And he was eventually forced to retire because the Pentagon told him, you don't have a future here in the Army. And he said, okay. And he stayed on, became a civilian, retired, left the Army after 35 years, became a civilian on the NSC staff, and eventually became ambassador to NATO. But you sort of see the tension there, which is serving at the pleasure of the president, you're occasionally going to have to disagree with your home office. And that's a challenge that Doug Lute had, but he's not the first one. I write in the book about others that had to deal with that. And it's one of many reasons it tends to be a contentious piece. And it's one of many reasons that, the people the stories I tell are people who decided to fight for the president, even though they thought he was, regardless of what those on their friends in government and friends out of government said. And so they've tended to come up and take a beating in their careers. It tends to hurt your careers occasionally when you sort of upset your friends and your allies in government.
Yeah, so let's another thing that you talk a lot about in the book, and it's actually relevant. You mentioned it. It's relevant today, and it'd be relevant for the Biden administration. Is this tendency for the NSC to get big, right? So
yeah.
Presidents come in and they're like, oh, this thing is too big. It's unwieldy. It's got problems. They're unaccountable, right? It's a bunch of staffers running around, whatever. And a new administration takes over, much like the Trump administration, right? We're going to cut this thing down to size. Turns out to actually be really hard to do. And often the staffs actually get bigger rather than smaller. So first I wanted you to talk a little bit about this kind of tendency, and you're pretty critical of that in the book. Your sense, at least from what I remember, is that this is there's a lot of risks to this. There's a lot of problems with this tendency
With
to get big.
getting too big. Yeah.
Getting too
So there's a,
Wait,
there's
let me
a
just
Scott.
put one more
Yep.
thing in your head, which is, okay, so if it's bad to be big, then why is the Trump approach been wrong? So, right, come in, let's get it smaller, right? This thing was unwieldy, 400, people, it was meeting after meeting after meeting, like, you're right. So maybe the guy's got a point.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I've gotten to think about. It's one of those scholars that says things like the NSC staff got too big, and then you see it get cut by a third in 2 months, and you say that might be too fast. That might be too fast, and then you see what happens. So it's one of those ones where as a scholar, you got to be careful what you wish for. So I think the tendency to get big is this, which is typically when you come into the White House, the staff is big, and that means that other things can't be big, right? So there's a great example of this, which is that Bill Clinton, when he was on the campaign trail in 1992, said, this is during the economic troubles of 1992, said, basically, I'm going to cut the White House staff by 25%. Across the board, cut it by 25%. I'm going to save money, right? We don't need all these people coming around. And the reporters followed up. They were like, even on national security? And he said, yeah, on national security, everything's getting cut 25%. And so when they got into the transition, kind of like what we're doing now, and they opened the hood on government, what they found is that the White House staff actually wasn't as big as they thought. And the NSC staff was much smaller than they thought. And so it was tiny. And under George H.W. Bush, especially compared to what it is today. And they panicked because they said, well, we're not going to be able to do what we need to do. And so they thought about reneging on the campaign promise, but Clinton thought, I can't renege on it. We got to keep it going. So they cut the staff, and they regretted it immediately. And so the size of the staff is always a challenge. And the reason it's a challenge is that the staff, what very often happens is that presidents, no matter who they are, no matter what they believe, always find it challenging to get government to do what they want it to do. It is a hard thing to do. Bureaucracy does its thing. Whether it's the CIA bureaucracy, the DoD bureaucracy, they want a thing, they want something, and they will work to get it, regardless of what the president orders or what the president wants. And it is a fight, and it is a constant struggle to get the government to do what you want. And the easiest thing to do is for the staff to basically push on the government. And the more staff you have, the better able they are to do it. And the next easiest thing for them to do is just the staff to try and do it on their own, which is what you've seen more and more, which is that the NSC has typically been able, especially since it's gotten bigger, to be able to write war plans, to do those sorts of things, because telecommunications has gotten better. They're able to sort of travel more easily, get information more easily. And so they're able to do more than they used to in the old days. Bureaucracy it's not as easy a fight for the bureaucracy to hide information and to control things. So generally speaking, what you see is that NSCs tend to get bigger, especially in two-term presidencies. I think somebody did the math once, and it basically doubles in a two-term presidency, the size of the staff. Whatever it was when you come in, it gets bigger. That's tends to be bureaucratic, partisan, patronage kind of stuff, where just the shop gets bigger. Part of that is, you get more priorities. So you say, hey, I'm worried about Ebola, right? So classic example is the Obama administration came in and got rid of the global health security, the pandemic unit at the NSC. They got rid of it. They said, we'll let the State Department do this. We'll let CDC do it. So they got rid of it. And then Ebola happens and becomes a national, a pandemic and a national concern, right? That was something that Donald Trump was criticizing the White House about. You remember those stories about people flying home with Ebola and all these sorts of things. And so they created a pandemic security unit at the White House on the NSC. And then Donald Trump came in and got rid of it, right? So they tend to show priorities, and they tend to grow that way. So it tends to grow, and that's unsurprising. What I would say about the Trump cuts is that the reasons for it were not about good government. And I think I argue in the book for good government, which I think we tend to envision like Leslie Knope on Parks and Recreation, or sort of your local good government matters. And right, we don't think about just a good, effective national government, right? We don't think about it that way. But I referred on good government, which is you need to do a better job, and has somebody who's worked at an agency and worked with a couple cabinet secretaries. There's ways to better inform what they do and help them do what they do and convince them to do what you want them to do than the NSC staff tends to do, which is either pick up the phone and tell you, well, I just got out of the president's office and the Oval Office, and he told me X, and you better do it, which I've gotten that call. It's not a fun call. You don't believe it, but you're kind of in a bad place because you kind of say, well, am I really going to tell this person to go pound sand? I've seen it done. It's not pretty, because then when you actually really do screw up, you get a call, as I've been on the other side of, from Air Force One, and says the National Security Advisor is calling to talk to you about something. And then you're really in a different place because you have to sort of worry about that, right? And so there's a better way to do government than screaming at people and leaning on people. There has to be a way to sort of do these sorts of things. So that's always been my argument, and I think too many staffers tends to lead them not to do that, and I think that the track record proves well. Plus, additional staffers doesn't actually empower the agencies to do their jobs, which is to come up with national security policies and things along those lines. So I think there's a lot of experts in government, let you use them. The challenge with what the Trump administration did was the Trump administration didn't cut it out of good government. They cut it because they were upset after several NSC staffers were part of the effort to impeach President Trump. This is Alexander Vindman, this is Fiona Hill, this is others who went up and testified against the president. That was the reason he decided to cut the staff. They didn't cut the staff because they were worried about getting what the president wanted out of government. They were upset that they thought that people were leaking on him. And there were probably people leaking on him, but they were going up to Congress and saying what they thought because they were subpoenaed and because they believed that what the president did was wrong. So that was the main driver. The second reason that the cuts were a concern is they cut a third of the staff in 3 months. They cut it from about 180 to 107, 110. Any organization, I'm sure there are people who run organizations, whether it's a school, whether it's a government, whether it's a business, you cut 30% of a staff, almost 40% of a staff in 3 months, you are going to have problems. Signals are going to get missed, mistakes are going to be made, and you perhaps have a reason to do that, but you'll deal with the consequences. Well, I think the consequences of this in part was the coronavirus outbreak, which went from a small concern to one that was a massive national security challenge. That's the worst case scenario. That's the reason no president has ever cut the staff by a third before, because if you cut the staff by a third and then you see a massive security threat happen, you look like you are to blame. And there's a part that probably is to blame. And what Donald Trump did was not stop what he was trying to do, which was cut the staff. He tried to create a new staff, which was he created with Dr. Birx and others, tried to create a coronavirus task force, and with Jared Kushner and what he was doing. So they both failed in managing the staff in terms of its cuts, and then they failed in trying to fix the problem, which they could have done by just rebuilding out the staff. And instead they tried to do it on the fly. So it was a massive failure of government. And I think, there aren't many times I can say that the NSC staff really does affect your lives, but it has affected all our lives. I mean, most people aren't going to be able to have Thanksgiving with the people they want next week. And that's partly due to the NSC staff and what's happened to it over the last year.
So a good place to maybe talk a little bit about the transition. So what is the Biden administration going to find when they finally do get access to, the president-elect gets access to some of the staff, some of the resources, some of the information, intelligence briefings. We can talk about issues in a second, but what I mean is, what are they going to find when they walk into the West Wing and the EOB?
It's a great question. It's a great question. Did you have more, or is that
just a little bit, like, what do you have a sense they think they're going to need to be doing? Like, what do you think their priorities are likely to be as they walk back in?
I think, so I have the weird distinction of also serving as a Navy Reserve officer. So I still serve in the government. So I have, probably different than a lot of my compatriots in the in the Obama administration, several of whom are going to go into the Biden administration. And, Joe Biden was a professor at Penn until last year. So he's a compatriot there too. So it's kind of interesting to see. I think very few people, I think the past 4 years, there are people who like Donald Trump and there are people who don't like Donald Trump. I have people in my family who are both. And what I would say about it is Donald Trump, because of the way he behaves, tends to get a lot of the attention for what's wrong or what's right about this era. And, it's his tweets, it's his personality, he tends to get a lot of the attention. What I don't think people have seen is that government has taken an absolute beating the past 4 years. Part of that would have been true with a president that has such different views about the world than recent presidents have had, which have been much more globalist. Donald Trump's much more nationalist. So there's a piece of it that, there was always going to be differences of opinion. But he has, I think, and his team have taken a far more antagonistic approach to government, making life relatively uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous for people. I mean, they have suggested that people are deep state. They have suggested people are spies. They have done these sorts of things. And, people's lives have been threatened. People's, livelihoods have been lost. People have had to leave government or lost their jobs. It has not been a very fun 4 years. And I think Donald Trump has typically not engaged with the parts of government that are, the things that are its lifeblood, process and bureaucracy. He has tended to issue executive orders and go from there. And for a while, that government kept doing its own thing. But slowly, he has sort of targeted and pushed and purged officials out over the last 2 years in a very serious way. And I think government is a very damaged institution right now, in part because there is so much distrust within it. I mean, we tend to talk about the distrust of government. There's a lot of distrust in government. Government is a wounded animal right now, and it is a dangerous thing to approach, and it's going to take a lot of work to get it back where it needs to go. And so what I think there's very few people who have really seen that. I've done it just because this is what I do. And I've written about it. This is what I do. I mean, people are shocked when I tell them the stories about numbers leaving, the number of people who have left the State Department, the number of jobs that have been left open at the CDC, the people who have been put into positions of power at Voice of America, who don't believe in Voice of America, the budget cuts, the games that have been played. Just in the past week, he's sent 3 or 4 hugely inexperienced, underqualified people into serious positions of power at the Pentagon for really no clear purpose, right? That drives people out of government and it undermines government. So this is going to be a challenge. I don't think there will ever be a normal transition. I don't think it will ever happen. This is not somebody who took his own transition seriously. He didn't make the transition a big part of his government, barely emphasized it, barely put any effort into it. And I don't think he believes much in Joe Biden's administration or its transition. So I don't think it's going to ever happen in the way people experience. So what we'll find is that that people who are going into government will find out sometime in January. If they find out sooner, the better. But my hunch is most of them won't really get an idea until they start having informal meetings outside of the normal transition and in government when they get in, how bad it is. And then they will need to try to achieve Joe Biden's very ambitious national security policy with a broken government while they try to fix it. It is going to be a very difficult few years. And I think that is a real challenge. And I think that's one that it gets more challenging with each day that passes.
Okay, so I have one more, but before I ask this question, I just want to let everybody know, you could maybe start to put some things into the chat if you have some questions for John. So I think he and I are going to talk for a few more minutes about kind of just current issues around the world. But please do kind of like start to maybe formulate your questions and put them into the chat so we can get to them soon. So I wanted to ask, besides like inheriting, staffing problems and morale problems, resource problems, political problems, and conflicts, you know, probably with the Hill. There's also just problems out there, right, in the rest of the world. So if we could, maybe we could do kind of a quick round the world and talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's going on. So, you know, the Trump administration, a lot of the foreign policy was really a huge departure from kind of what the status quo had been. And as you notice, you know, as you said, you know, globalist toward nationalist, a disengagement kind of around the world on many things, but then odd engagements in other places where we hadn't really been. So I'm thinking of Russia, for example, where we really hadn't, you know, been very engaged or been very friendly. But so a shift, or a real shift in some of the relationships. So maybe we could start with, well, I'll start with Asia. Could you talk a little bit about what you think the Biden administration's foreign policy priorities seem like they might be toward Asia, how hard that might be, kind of any views you have on that?
Yeah, it's a great example of the challenge going forward, which is Asia has not stopped being Asia, which is a hugely dynamic place that was on, you know, a remarkable trajectory, right? You know, and remains on that trajectory even despite COVID, right? You know, China's rise continues. You know, Japan's, you know, modernization of its military continues. South Korea, North Korea continue their nuclear. North Korea's nuclear regime, you know, program continues, right? All of these things have continued and made progress over 4 years. And the Biden administration is going to be sort of meeting a moving car there, right? And in many ways, you know, the sort of challenge that a lot of countries, especially, we have a ton of alliances, right, in Asia, right? Japan, Korea, Thailand, you know, Australia, New Zealand. These are places that we are deeply tied. And then we have several partners in the region, you know, whether it's Singapore or India and things along those lines. These are places that have had to balance, you know, between the question of whether Trump's sort of disengagement and far more transactional relationship with the region was sort of a 4-year thing, or it could go on longer. And so the Biden administration has to deal with the ramifications of it, which are, you know, progress has been made without us, right? There's just been sort of some economic trade deals made between Asian countries that the United States hasn't been part of, right? And so the economics of Asia have changed, and they will have to catch up. A few, I think, developments within the Democratic Party reflect an evolution on China in particular, right? I think there are far fewer people today who believe in that engagement will change China, and that China will become more democratic and more, you know, liberal over time with our engagement. I think Democrats have moved away from that position. I think that Democratic voters and American voters writ large have gotten more frustrated with China, and our allies have gotten much more frustrated with China. So I expect to see a more confrontational relationship and approach to China, even as that sort of trajectory in the region has changed. So it'll be a really difficult, really sort of a fine needle to thread. It's possible, but it will be interesting to watch. That's one place that I think will be really fascinating because you know, it's a place where the Asia Pacific is always a place where we have, you know, always occasionally been outsiders, even though we are a Pacific country. And so it will be fascinating to watch that happen. And it'll be tough because I think the United States is going to be, you know, we can't travel to most Asian countries right now. The U.S. government can, but, you know, this is a time where Americans are being kept out of the game. And that has implications for our foreign policy too. So COVID is a huge thing. But it's also that the changes it's created and the crisis it's created is an opportunity for the Biden administration to change some things. I think American companies developing the vaccine with German companies is a huge thing. Like, these are things that will change things and change the dynamic in ways perhaps more profoundly than Donald Trump and Joe Biden will personally.
Okay, how about Middle East? Another,
you know,
complicated.
The Middle East. Yeah, another one.
Another easy one, right?
Another easy one. Its trajectory is perhaps not as upward as Asia. It's a little more sort of just sort of always right above the horizon here. I think that the Afghanistan decision is a fascinating one. My hunch is that there might be Donald Trump might be doing Joe Biden a favor there and disengaging a little bit from Afghanistan. That's me just speculating a little bit in the sense that, if the United States can make it can sort of downsize its engagement a little bit in the wars, that could potentially open up some opportunities there. It'll have some downsides as well, but it might open up some opportunities. My hunch is that the Democratic Party has grown far more frustrated with Saudi Arabia than it was 4 years ago, and that is a big change. I think terrorism has gone down the list of people's concerns in recent years. So will that be as big a reason for us to stay there? I'm not sure. When coronavirus has done, more damage than the 9/11 terrorists ever did. So it'll be interesting to see if that changes it. I mean, I got my start in national security working at Ground Zero for FEMA 19 years ago in Manhattan. I worked down there doing the press work for FEMA at Ground Zero. So this is a part of my life. But for a lot of Americans, this is the big national security issue of their lives is coronavirus. So that might mean that people are less stressed about the Middle East and might give an opportunity for Americans to sort of disengage or at least ignore a little more the problems of the Middle East.
So I was going to ask you about Europe, but I got a question from the audience. So let me move to Latin America.
Sure.
So Juan to put something in the chat, but I was going to ask you about Latin America anyway. His question is about the Biden administration and its role in Latin America, and he's particularly interested in the Venezuela crisis. I'm also slightly curious about the Cuba story, because the story on the way out, when the Obama administration left, was the door was starting to open and then it slammed shut again. So is it going to open up again? So if you have any thoughts on Latin America.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think my sense of it is that on Latin America, and I think that the big Latin America story over the next year or so will be less on these sort of crises and, on Venezuela and things along those. I think the COVID story will be a huge impact on Latin America. I mean, I think that is one place where in the developing world where you have seen massive problems and are going to continue to see massive problems. And I think that will have geopolitical implications for the region. My other hunch is that Biden does have a lot of relationships in Latin America. I don't think a lot of those relationships are operative right now. So he has a ton of relationships with leaders there, but they tend not to be in power. So it'll be interesting to see how he engages in that. Cuba, I think, will be fascinating, in part because that was an Obama-Biden administration policy. But the other piece of it is that I think that we did see it actually have a political impact on voters in Florida. And so I'm intrigued to see how they play that and how Cuba wants to play it. I think those are the two questions that people tend not to actually always think about, is like, what does Cuba want out of the United States right now? I don't actually know the answer to that question. If Juan has an answer, I'd love to hear it. On Venezuela, my hunch is that there will be an effort to try to actually get to the bottom on what the Trump administration is doing. I don't think we actually have any clarity on that, what they've been doing, what they've been sending down there, who's been acting on our behalf. I think that is a fundamentally undercovered story. And the Trump administration has been very actually hasn't given much information out on it. So I think one of the first things that will be done will be a exorcism and, to a degree, an exposure of a lot of details. I don't think there will be a huge effort to try and arrest or prosecute people in the Biden administration, but I think there will be exposure of a lot of what Trump's been up to that we actually don't know. And I think Venezuela is one of those stories that there's a lot of people who are eager to get a hold of American classified information again and say, exactly what have we been doing? Because I don't think the story is clear for me. And I'm a fairly intensive reader of things, but not deeply read on that region in the past few years. So I'll be interested to see.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to get to that one in a second. How about Russia? I think we should maybe talk about Russia as another sort of major player that the Biden administration is going to have to deal with. If you want to kind of do Russia Europe at the same time, that would be fine.
Yeah,
I get a couple questions coming in.
Joe Biden is an Atlanticist at heart. This is who he is. He is somebody who is deeply interested in the challenges and opportunities in Europe, deeply ingrained in Europe, remained that way through his administration, through the Obama-Biden administration, through his post White House years. So this is one where I think we probably see the sharpest departure from American foreign policy, right? Even if you ignore all the conspiracies about Donald Trump and Russia, you cannot ignore how dedicated Joe Biden is to NATO, and how dedicated his team will be to sort of reaffirming America's engagement and commitment to that continent, and picking up where we left off. I mean, I think that Americans' memories might be a little short on how the Obama administration ended, but the attack on the democracy that Russia perpetrated in 2016 is a big memory for those of us who were there at the time. It is something that we regret. It is something that we probably feel some secret guilt over because it happened on our watch. And it's something that had massive effects on America. And I don't feel as though, despite the fact that the Obama-Biden team took a huge initiative to punish Russia with sanctions and other things at the end of the administration, I don't think anybody feels that enough has been done to sort of deter them in the future. So my hunch is that will be probably the place where the sharpest departure will be. That is, it will be probably the thing to watch in the next year or two. And so my hunch is that that is, that's the one I think everybody's fascinated to watch. And that's the one, truthfully, where I do feel as though, I've talked about all these regions, but I haven't talked about the fact that I do believe Donald Trump's still going to be a voice on foreign policy, criticizing what Joe Biden does over the next few years, second guessing him, pretending he's still, got some influence and power. So I do find that is one where it will be a three-dimensional conversation when Joe Biden is engaging and probably standing and correcting Vladimir Putin at a press conference later this year, somewhere along the way. Donald Trump's voice will be heard. And it will also be the place where I think we have to do the most work to try and remind people that, Donald Trump was elected. And I think the Biden administration is going to try to say this was a one-time thing and try to convince Europeans that it's not going to happen again. That'll be a challenge. I mean, I don't think Europeans are going to forget Donald Trump anytime soon.
Okay, I'm going to ask you maybe, I'm going to get a little into the weeds, but a couple of people had some very specific questions. And if it's like a little outside something, you don't feel prepared, sure, we can move on back to the NSC stuff. But
no, it's okay.
So Mark Chandler wanted to ask, how important is the recent U.S. missile defense test and the consequences of withdrawing from the ABM Treaty in 2002 to MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction Doctrine, which was premised on second strike capability? I could see.
Great question.
Yeah.
I think you got it right. One of the first things I ever did, it was like sort of serious scholarship, as I studied, Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, right? And SDI, which was known as Star Wars back in the 80s. And it's a fascinating story. And it's one of those stories, and it's one of those things that is like, you can point to, and occasionally I have pointed to it with students, which is like, this is something that like only the United States would attempt in its sheer audacity, potential folly, and its sheer expense. And we have been at it for 40 years, right? I mean, there's no other country that would continue to spend this amount of much money on something that has on many occasions been said to be both impossible and dangerous, and yet we continue to do it. Like, there are times where you can kind of like roll your eyes and say America's done, and I always sort of you know, you can look at America's glass as half full or half empty, but, you know, I was, you know, people get frustrated with, you know, after 9/11, which is a big defining thing, you know, money was wasted. And I kind of said, America always wastes money. The question is like, what gets done along the way? And since 9/11, some terrible things have happened, but some amazing things have happened. They, you know, you rebuilt Lower Manhattan without, you know, one of the biggest cities in the world, and made it a better place. And, you know, other things have happened. So it's kind of amusing to kind of see this. I am sort of shocked that it worked, because the last time I was in government, like, it was still sort of considered folly. But the thing about it is the technology has advanced so far, and sometimes you just have to wait for the technology to advance. So it is fascinating. It is awe-inspiring in some ways and terrifying in some ways, because if we can do it, somebody else will figure out how to do it. I started talking about nuclear weapons, right? Which was one of those things that, like, you thought at the time, oh, this is one of the things America alone could do. And look, you know, within a few years, the Soviets had done it. So it is one of those ones where it will have ramifications for the nuclear balance. And anything that has ramifications for the nuclear balance is scary, because it means that others might feel like their weapons aren't what they wanted them to be anymore, right? So a country like Russia, a country like North Korea, a country like China has what they have, and they don't mean as much if the United States has what it has. And so it will be a destabilizing moment, at a time where we probably don't need many more destabilizing moments. But it is, I think, one of those that as an American, I'm like, good on us, we finally did it. But as a person who looks at the geopolitical risks of destabilization in the nuclear balance, I worry. But my hunch is that it will be quickly followed by somebody else either stealing the technology or copycatting the technology, and that some new balance will sort of get created.
Great. So I'm going to maybe go back to some of the regional questions. So I have two, they're not completely overlapping, but we'll give it a shot. So from Timothy Sandrum, in all the regional analysis, we haven't discussed Africa. How much does Africa feature as a critical piece in the U.S. national security and foreign policy analysis and planning? Well, we'll do that, and then we'll kind of go to the next one. So Africa.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that for many people, Africa is like is in some ways similar to pandemics, which is it tends to be the focus of a few very passionate people within government and within national security, the national security establishment. But it's also one of those things that has the potential to be huge, right? But it's still only studied by a few people and worked on by a few people, right? I think I'm not the first person to say it, but I think it's a fair point, which is that the United States tends to think about Africa as a source of problems instead of a source of opportunities. I think that, whether it's terror, whether it's instability, whether it's outbreaks, things along those lines, that tends to be the worry in Africa versus the sort of looking at the huge progress and development that's gone on that continent in the past 4 years, let alone in the past 20. So I think my hunch is that will still be how, because the Biden administration is going to be so busy, that will still be the sort of defining worldview of it, just because that's been the worldview for a few years. I think that the reason it might get more interesting and it might get more attention and more money and more resources is in part because I think that's where the race with China is going to be taking place, is in Africa and in other places. And so my hunch is that you will actually see greater interest in it, not because Africa is important because it's Africa and it's important to the United States on its own terms, but because, in whatever we call the competition with China, and people don't like to call it a Cold War, but whatever it is, the last Cold War was probably the last time Americans spent a tremendous amount of time and resources and energy trying to support African countries. And so my hunch is that will be what it requires again to do the same. But that's a little bit pessimistic, so I don't want to say that. I'm sure the Biden administration has some big plans. The question is whether they can rise to the level of priorities without a problem. I hope they can, because there are some real opportunities there, but I worry that that's how it will go again.
Okay, and then we have another regional kind of specific, sort of related, from Jane Gartner. In the Red Sea region, specifically the Bab el-Mandeb access point, I don't actually know where that is, what should be the US focus in terms of security threats to the safety of trade, given China and Saudi interests there, as well as the instability and wars in Ethiopia?
It's a great question. It's a very specific question. I will say this, which is I've been near there with the Navy, so I can say that. I think that this not to sort of go too vague. I do think that America's vision of choke points of the Red Sea, of the Gulf and other places has tended to be very non-state focused, which is terror groups or with the support of groups, nations like Iran and other places. What I believe you will start seeing is a greater shift away from non-state / sort of black swan kind of events where somehow a terrorist group is able to do something that rises to the level of an international incident because it is a trade route or something along those lines, to where the United States is in specific competition for access to places with China. I do think that's where we will be, if not in the next 4 years, then in the next 10, and that there will be times where our two navies run into each other, and there will really be times where there are potential, American ships are sailing by a Chinese-run port, whether it's in Thailand and Pakistan or something along those lines, and there will be problems. So that is, I think, where we're going, and the competition will be, the security challenge will be less, hey, how do we make sure nothing bad happens here, to hey, how do we make sure all the bad stuff that's going on between our two countries doesn't end up here? And that's a very different mindset, and it's a very sort of more challenging one. And it's one where, truth be told, like it gets to the point where the institutions do matter, right? Having a Navy that doesn't end up in a war because it screws something up in one of those choke points, whether it's in the South China Sea, the Red Sea, the Gulf, things along those lines, is different when your Navy's in top shape than when your Navy's in bad shape. And so I do think that this is one of those ones where the geopolitical policy being set at the White House and being set in Beijing is going to be in the hands of institutions that are imperfect and in some ways in very bad shape. The Chinese Navy is nothing to scream about either. And so that's where errors can happen. And so that will be, I think, one of the real challenges for the Biden administration and for the United States and China and the world in the years ahead.
Okay, maybe kind of ask you a little bit about, I just want to go back to the NSC for a second specifically. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, I don't want to ask you who you think the National Security Advisor would be, although I really kind of want to, but.
Go ahead, ask.
All right.
I don't know the answer, so I'm happy to answer.
I'm curious what you think. I guess I'm curious what you think that person's gonna, what their biggest, I mean, we've talked about some of their challenges, but how's the role changed? And is there anything we should be thinking about when this person, is announced? I mean, is there, so, I mean, how's the role changed? I mean, you said you talked to how many, 10 national security advisors? I guess, what would they advise this new national security advisor walking in?
That's a great question. I mean, my hunch is that, Joe Biden has, I found this great quote, which is, Joe Biden doesn't appear in the book very often because he was vice president, and I only focused one chapter on the Obama administration, and he was vice president. But I do quote him from 1981, and in 1981, he was criticizing somebody for being inexperienced on foreign policy. And one day, being a little cheeky, I looked up the date, and then I looked up how old Mayor Pete Buttigieg was at the time of that quote. And he hadn't been born yet. So I joked that Joe Biden has been telling people they're inexperienced for longer than Mayor Pete has been alive. Like, that's how long he's been talking about foreign policy and inexperienced foreign policy. And so as a result, he knows a lot of people, and he has a lot of people who could be national security advisor. I think he ended up having 3 or 4 national security advisors who were his national security advisor as vice president. So all 3 of them are arguably in the running to be national security advisor. He had Tony Blinken, who's a name most people have now heard from the campaign. He had Jake Sullivan, who some people have heard of, and he had a gentleman named Colin Kahl. So that's 3, right? And then he has, several deputies and others from the Obama administration, of Avril Haines, who's been running his transition, who could very well be she was deputy national security advisor in the Obama administration. She could very easily be national security advisor. And there's several others who could be the job. So it's one of those ones where he has, typically speaking, most people only have 1 or 2 people that could do that job when they come in. He has 6 or 7. So it's he is easily in the top 5 of national security, with national security experiences and foreign policy experiences, probably of anybody. I mean, the list is basically him, George H.W. Bush, Dwight Eisenhower, and you very quickly go down the list, and there's not many more going back to George Washington. It's a very short list. John Quincy Adams, maybe, right? This is not a list of people who typically come in. We typically don't elect foreign policy presidents. Joe Biden is one. So my hunch is that he is going to want somebody who is very clearly aligned with his views. He is going to have somebody who is ready with every ounce of their being to go all the time. The one thing I never appreciated, I wrote this book, I wrote a dissertation on the National Security Council, and interviewed a lot of people, and then went into government and got to know the national security advisor, got to know people. And I would say that it is the job that it is all the time. I had a friend who was a deputy national security advisor, like he was an usher at my wedding, like he was that close. And he would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, be in the office sometime after 5, basically email, do intelligence briefings, et cetera, so around 7:30, go to his first meeting, and really be in meetings from 7:30 until 9, 10 o'clock at night, in which he would go back and do all his emails until 11 and go home and go to sleep. And so that was his life every day for 2 years. So the National Security Advisor is even more intense, right? Because they spend a lot more time with the president, and which is a intense thing to do, to be around the president. It's intense to be around people like this because they have a lot of power and they're moving and have a lot of weight on their shoulders. So I think it will have to be somebody who's got the capacity to do that for 2 or 3 or 4 years. My hunch, I have no bearing on this, and my hunch is going to want somebody that knows the National Security Council, which is an institution that is real and has to be rebuilt, and also probably somebody that knows government pretty well, because they're going to have to know how. I think he's going to want somebody who is simpatico with other people, right? The only way this is going to work is if everybody's in it and going together, and he's going to have somebody who's able to do that. So it won't be easy. My hunch is that National Security Advisor is going to have to probably rebuild an institution, which isn't typically something a National Security Advisor has to do, right? That's not, the job is typically you're advising the president, that's your job, and running a process of getting everybody in government together. Very rarely are you focused on the institution. And so that will be a challenge, and it will be one that will consume a lot of time. And that's hard because they don't have a lot of time. That's a job that doesn't come with a lot of time. It's, I've seen SecDefs, and, I've spent days with Secretary of Defense. They have a little more time to build institutions built in. The National Security Advisor really doesn't. And so they're going to have to figure out how to do that.
Okay. So I have one more question. So
sure.
I think what I'll do is I'll ask you one more question, and then we'll kind of end the formal thing. There might be 1 or 2 people who have one more thing they might like to ask you. So, but I just want to get people off by, in the next 5-10 minutes or so.
Sounds good.
Okay, so one of my favorite questions, to end with, what is your next project? What are you worried about? What are you working on now?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question because it's such a weird time in the world. So I'll tell you what it won't be, because that's kind of an interesting story as it is. So I started a process of writing a book about 9/11. So I was going to write a book about 9/11, and I had a ton of interest in this book on the people who basically went into government after 9/11. And so I was going to write this book. And the publishers were all interested in it last year at this time. And so sometime, I worked on it over the winter. COVID happened. I got a little delayed. And so I sent it in May. And everybody was like, "Oh, thank you so much. So interesting." And they all and as the weeks went by, more of COVID, it just became clear that they kind of said, "Well, I don't know." They kind of said, "Well, I don't know if 9/11 has the same impact or importance anymore." And it was very fascinating to sort of watch, right? Like to watch an event, like I have some personal interest in 9/11, but it was fascinating to watch something get what they call in government overtaken by events, right? Which is, you might write, there's a great example of this, which is in the book, I write about how Richard Haas, who some of you know from Morning Joe and MSNBC, wrote up talking points for President George H.W. Bush to call Saddam Hussein the night they were looking like he was going to invade Kuwait back in August of 1990. And he had to race all over the White House to find the president to have him call Saddam Hussein and try and get him on the phone to try and talk him out of doing this. And they finally found him. He had hurt his shoulder. Bush had hurt his shoulder, so he was getting it looked at in the White House medical unit. They found him sitting there in shorts and a t-shirt, and kind of getting his muscle rubbed to see if they could figure out what's going on. So the president grabs a phone. He's going to call Saddam Hussein, and just then the phone rings, and it's somebody from the Situation Room saying, "Well, it's over. They're already invading." And so these talking points, this phone call was overtaken by events. So it's kind of fascinating to see this book idea kind of get overtaken by events. And so, there was sort of dwindling interest, and eventually I sort of said, "Well, it's not going to happen. Like that's life in the world, right?" And there are certainly worse problems to have in a pandemic. But I do think it's fascinating to think a little bit about how Americans are thinking about the world after COVID. And I think that's a question that I'm going to be spending some time on and thinking, my life changed because of 9/11. I worked, I watched the second plane hit. I worked at Ground Zero and have dedicated my life to national security as a result of it. What's going to happen from now in American foreign policy? And it's a question that is, despite the election of Joe Biden, presidents don't pick foreign policy, the people do. So it will be fascinating to see what Americans do about this in the years ahead. And so for me, I think I will probably look at doing something on that. I haven't quite nailed it all down, but I have some good ideas. And then, it'll be interesting to see how a Joe Biden administration changes Penn, where I work, and changes friends of mine will go into government and do those kinds of things. And, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I think I have an idea on how this sort of past few years and this past year in particular will reshape America's relationship with the world. So I think that's where I'm going to spend my time.
Sounds great. Sounds great. So just want to thank you and thank everybody for showing up tonight. Yeah, it was really fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really fun. And so anybody who wants to stay on, if they have maybe a question they want to ask John, sounds like he can stay a couple more minutes.
Sure.
But I know, it's almost 9:15, so I want to let people go if they want to get going. But thanks for joining, and look for a note about our next stuff. And hopefully I'll see you at a future event.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. So I do know, for example, Juan, did you stay on? I don't know if Juan is still on. Let's see, looks like he is.
Yes, I'm still here. Thank you.
Did you want to ask your question?
Yes. So, John, my question. Well, thank you first off for doing this. It's really enlightening.
Happy to do it.
And I guess my question. I'm currently a student of international relations at Seton Hall University.
Good for you.
my question is, you know, has America's isolationism over the past 4 years impacted our ability to remain a trusted ally in the global arena? But also, will the U.S. be able to undo some of the residual effects from the previous administration, or is that an issue that is likely to spill over into future administrations past the Biden administration?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's, you know, a critical one in the years ahead. You know, it's very funny. When I was a graduate student of international relations, I spent my first year of my master's program in Italy, and I was in Italy, and God, I'm genuinely speaking, I'm feeling like I'm dating it, feeling like it's blurry, but it was during the Bush administration, so it was 2000, and I went over in 2007. It was fascinating about that is I heard the virulent frustration with the Bush administration in Italy, right? Like Italy, especially sort of a lefty town where I was living, was very anti-Bush. And, you know, I heard, you know, I studied with European students, so I heard their frustrations over Iraq and much more. So I remember being impressed with how, and when Barack Obama got elected, which I had already come home when that happened, I remember thinking like, oh yeah, America's back. Like America, you know, this sort of good, this, you know, he was such a charismatic figure. He had, you know, had given speeches during the campaign to thousands of people in Germany. And it was very funny. So flash forward, I was doing my dissertation, and I was writing my dissertation. It was weird because I was supposed to go to Afghanistan with the Navy. I was supposed to go on an assignment there. And at the last minute, it fell through, like a month, 6 weeks before. And so I was had already started to move to get out of my apartment. So I was like, you know what, I'm just going to go live in Italy for a year and write my dissertation. And so I went back to the same town but moved into a small apartment. And this was 2013. And what was fascinating about 2013 is everybody was calling Barack Obama, they would call him assassino, right? They would call him the assassin because of drones. So my point of this is that, you know, they're always going to have something to complain about the United States. So Donald Trump just made it really easy to give them 1,000 things to complain about. So I think that my feelings on this are that Donald Trump embodied a lot of things that people have always said about the United States, that they were, you know, rude and brash and egotistical and nationalistic and isolationist. Like there are a lot of people who have always said that about the United States. The United States always, whoever's in that job will always inspire lots of different feelings, some of them very negative in parts of the world, in part because, not just because of who they are, but because of the power they hold. So my viewpoint on it is that 100% just, you know, I mean, just the change in image, the change in tweets, the change in everything is going to change America's image to the world. I think that to the world, I think they worry about the stuff they're seeing right now with, you know, the stuff in Michigan and all the other stuff going on. They see Trump in some ways for what, you know, they've seen in their own countries, which is people that are trying to undermine democracy or have undermined democracy. But I think they probably do see is that Joe Biden's probably going to win by 7 or 8 million votes. So I do think that there will be a shift in opinions about the United States. But Joe Biden will do things that will not make people happy, including in some ways confronting Russia and doing those sorts of things, right? So that my hunch is that that is true. My other hunch is that Donald Trump is not going away. People that win 73 million votes don't go away. And that was just this past time. I haven't done the math, but I think he's now gotten more votes for the presidency than any person in history. That might bother people, but if you add his 2 elections, he's definitely higher than, I believe, anybody. I think he's higher than Obama now, which is shocking to some people. And it's certainly, when you think about it, kind of shocking. But what I'd say about that is that Trump is not going anywhere. He's got 83 million Twitter followers, and he is going to be a voice. He is not, I think, pretty clearly not going to be Sarah Palin, where he just disappears and is kind of out there on Facebook, but not really a force. He's much more likely to be a factor like Le Pen in France, which is he is going to be promoting a worldview, stoking political tensions, criticizing and trying to be a god, if not a candidate again, then a kingmaker, godfather in the Republican Party. So my hunch is that that Joe Biden actually might have more support abroad than he would have otherwise, because people will think, well, we see the alternative again, and it's not a threat that's going away, and it's not a challenge that's not going away. So my hunch is that it will be a much more complicated situation. And the other thing is, I'll say, is that the United States, COVID is going to scramble this country's eggs in a real way. I don't know about everybody else, but I haven't left my house more than to go to the grocery store for 9 months, and I think there's a lot of people like me. There's a lot of people. Americans are not abroad anymore the way they were. People aren't seeing Americans the way they were. That will, have an implication. America's best ambassadors are always its people, and they're not there. Penn students aren't studying abroad, right? The world is going to be changed by COVID fundamentally. And we all, I think, occasionally, maybe it's because we're in Jersey, so we're used to the pharmaceutical industry. We all sort of see that vaccine coming, and we're like, we're going to get it. This is going to have an implication for America's relationship with the world in big ways and small ways that have nothing to do with Joe Biden. I do think that presents opportunities, but it's also it always gives and takes. So there will be some challenges with it. So I do think that if you believe in American foreign policy and believe in America's relationship with the world, and believe in America as an engaged party in the world, Joe Biden, you couldn't have a better president for that worldview. And so that's where he will lean in this process. And that will have moments when it works and moments when it doesn't. But he will, I think, has the capacity to make it work if anybody else can. And certainly better, I assume, if you believe in that worldview, better than it's worked the past few years.
Thank you. From one Navy veteran to another. Thanks for your service as well.
Thank you for your service.
I don't know. Anybody else have anything? Should we let John get back? I'm not seeing anything pop up. Oh, actually, there is one from David. How would you improve, what in your opinion would improve the quality of decision making by the NSC? And there's one thing I wanted to ask you too, which is, the NSC has a reputation for being secretive, closed, kind of unaccountable. And there's a sense that it's left it more vulnerable, right? Because it doesn't have that kind of transparency. It doesn't go out and kind of make friends, and play the game. It's kind of too busy and, doing its own thing. And it doesn't have those sort of Senate confirmation positions and any of that kind of open that up a bit. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, right, the quality of decision making and whether the NSC needs to do business a little differently to make itself a little less vulnerable to this kind of deep state accusations.
Charge. Yeah, it's a great. It's a great question. I think that one of the challenges, and this is very fascinating, because I will tell a story that I shouldn't tell, but I will tell a story because this is a smaller group, so we're all old friends now at this point. We've been together for an hour and 20 minutes, but I'll tell a story, which is I at one point when I was speechwriter in government, I interviewed the National Security Advisor speechwriter, Susan Rice, and I was in the meeting. And I said, you guys should talk more about process, right? You should talk about how a decision is made, right? Like, what are the other options, right? We tend to talk about, this is the decision the president made and we're 100% there and we're going. And she was like, well, I don't, she's just like, that's an interesting question. Like, I could see it going either way. She kind of said, like, I think typically in government, we don't like to talk too much about process. Because it doesn't typically, it's not typically most people's concerns. And my argument is and remains, which is that Americans get frustrated with their foreign policy, in part because they don't know what the alternative is, right? So you don't like the Iran deal. Okay, well, here's the alternative, which is, Iran still developing nuclear weapons, threatening people in the region. America's military has to think about it and worry about it and deal with it. Right. We don't know the other option when we're going through it. And so, there's this great what they're sometimes called in government Goldilocks memos, which is a decision memo that goes to the president. It's like, here are your 3 options for dealing with whatever challenge it is: China's rise, Castro's death, Russia's hacking the military, and it's A, B, or C, and you pick one. And Henry Kissinger used to always say that there's 3 options: there's nuclear war, there's surrender, and there's what I want you to do, right? Like, you basically concoct these to be one's too hot, one's too cold, one's just right, and the just right is my idea. So, but the point of the story is, and the reason I tell that is that 90% of the time, and this is the hard thing with really sort of busting the NSC staff's chops, which I do, though I try to keep this in mind, which is 90% of the time the options are terrible, right? If it gets to the president, it's a hard decision, right? That's just the nature of the business. If somebody could make the decision, if it was easy, somebody would have made it, right? It would have been made by a naval officer in Afghanistan. It would have been made by an ambassador in Hanoi. It would have been made by a deputy secretary of state or an assistant secretary of defense, right? Like, easy decisions get made before they get to the president because, frankly, that's, 1, people like to take credit for them, but 2, it saves everybody the time. That's how government works. So the hardest decisions go up there. I think Barack Obama called the decision to go after bin Laden in Pakistan 50-50, which frankly was better odds than most of the people in government were giving it, right? Most of the people told him it wasn't worth it, but he decided to go for it, right? 50-50 odds is actually pretty terrible odds for a decision to put the amount of weight and people's lives on the line. It's, not a great, not where you want to be. Nobody on this call wants their life to be online for 50-50. And I actually worked in government with the Black Hawk pilot who flew bin Laden out from Abbottabad. He was my colleague in government. And, as he likes to say, I was the pilot that didn't crash, right? Because his was the helicopter that could fly on the way out. And, I love him like a brother. He was the guy who was charged with calling me with my wife went into labor with our first son. Right, that was his job because he was always at the office because his job was to always be there. He was kind of on the watch. And so I tell that story because most people don't know how terrible the options are. And if you told the options, they might actually feel better about the decisions you made. So that's what I've always argued. And I think that opening the process up would make people feel better about their government. Right now, government is to a degree, a thing that should just solve the problems. And, if it doesn't, something, it's not to be trusted. Well, government has a hard job. And if you don't explain that to people, show that to people, they don't get it. And they're not going to reward you when you do a good job. And I think that's kind of what we're facing with sort of this huge distrust in government. I said somewhere the other day that Pew found that 20% of Americans trust the government to do the right thing. Like, nothing's going to get done if 20% of Americans trust the government. I mean, that means like half of Trump's voters don't believe the government will do well. And he's president, right? I can only just imagine what it'll be under the Biden administration. So the point of this is to rebuild trust. You're going to have to show people that government works and is working for them, even if it doesn't get the answers right. And to do that, it's very hard to do it when you close doors all the time. And so I've argued, much to the frustration of some people, that you need to open up the NSC. I've argued that you should consider confirming National Security Council staffers and the National Security Advisor themselves, which would put them, the Senate would have a say over who goes on there, and it would promote and propose and expose these people right into a confirmation hearing. I don't think that would be as bad as people think it is, but there are a lot of people, including those who are probably going into the Biden administration, who would rather that not happen. But I don't think, an NSC can be effective if it's not being trusted by the American people. You might get a few good things done, but you're not going to get all the big things done. And that's the job. And so that's my hunch. It's not popular in Washington, not popular among national security people, but I'll stick to it. And even if I'm ever national security advisor, which I doubt, I will try to get it confirmed, though Lord knows if I would be. So we'll have to see.
Okay, John, we're right on to 9:30.
Great.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really,
a lot of
great
fun.
really great to chat. Okay, thanks everybody. And I'll follow up with you, John, a little bit.
Sounds good, Russ. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thank you guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.